Picture this. You're knee-deep in a trench packed with freezing sludge. The air stinks of sulfur, rot, and unwashed bodies. To your left, a German mercenary is sawing the leg off a dead horse and tearing into the meat raw. To your right, a cannonball the size of a pumpkin shears the top off a willow tree in a violent blur of splinters. But you're not gripping a pike or a musket. You're holding a fragile, polished viola da gamba, terrified the damp air will warp the wood before a bullet finds your chest. You are Claudio Monteverdi. You're 28 years old, and if a single stray shot cuts you down in this Hungarian wasteland, the future of Western music dies with you. No opera as we know it. No Monteverdi. Just another body dissolving into the mud. This is the absurd reality of the Siege of Esztergom in 1595. A meat grinder that didn't care about art, genius, or legacy. It swallowed everything the same way. Before we watch how this nightmare reshaped Europe, do me a favor. If you like the stories that don't make it into textbooks, hit that like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what's the most out-of-place object you've ever heard of in a war zone? A piano in the jungle? A violin in a trench? I want to hear it. Now wipe the mud from your eyes. We're standing on the most dangerous piece of real estate on Earth in the late 16th century. This is the collision point between the cross and the crescent. For 50 years, the Ottoman Empire has used the fortress of Esztergom as a shield of Islam, blocking the road north along the Danube to their occupied capital of Buda. In Vienna, the Habsburg emperors have stared at this fortress with obsession. They want it back. And this time, they haven't just sent an army. They've sent a chaotic, multinational mob. General Karl von Mansfeld peers at the fortress through a spyglass. He doesn't see holy ground. He sees geometry. Esztergom sits high on a rocky precipice, protected by the wide Danube River and steep, jagged cliffs. It's a masterpiece of defensive geography. A direct assault would be suicide. So Mansfeld turns the land itself into a weapon. Thousands of sappers, men treated lower than dirt, are driven into the earth. They dig trenches and tunnels that creep toward the walls like veins of infection. Pickaxes strike stone day and night, competing with the thunder of Ottoman artillery overhead. Inside the walls, the Janissaries watch the ground shift. These are elite troops, the Sultan's household soldiers, and they know the truth. No relief army is coming fast enough. Their only hope is to make the Christians bleed so badly, they abandon the siege altogether. Down in the Christian camp, that bleeding has already begun, just not from the enemy. Italian curses are screamed at German pikemen. Hungarian hussars spit in the dirt as Walloon mercenaries swagger past. This isn't a disciplined legion. It's a Tower of Babel armed with gunpowder. And drifting through it all is something far deadlier than cannon fire. Typhus. The Hungarian disease moves silently through the tents, turning strong men into shivering skeletons overnight. Monteverdi tries to tune his instrument inside his canvas shelter. The humidity snaps a string. The sharp crack sounds like a pistol shot, and he flinches. Outside, the heavy siege guns, sakers and culverins roar back to life. They hammer the water town, the lower defenses of Esztergom. Stone explodes. Dust clouds choke the sun. Ottoman cannonballs scream overhead and plunge into the river, throwing towering geysers of water into the air. This isn't a battle of heroes. It's a slow, grinding, industrial accident. The mud gets deeper, food grows scarce, and the walls of Esztergom still stand, tall and mocking, while thousands die in the muck below. The siege has barely begun, and already the gravediggers are the busiest men in camp. To understand why a musician from Mantua is freezing in a ditch in 1595, we need to zoom out. Way out. Look at a map of Europe in the late 16th century, and you won't see a clean line dividing east and west. You'll see a jagged scar cutting straight through Hungary. This is the military frontier, a lawless zone where peace existed only in diplomatic letters exchanged between Vienna and Constantinople. On the ground, it was a constant low-level bloodbath known as the Little War. Raids, burned villages, slave-taking. Violence wasn't an event here. It was a lifestyle. In 1593, 2 years before our story, the pot finally boiled over. The Ottoman governor of Bosnia launched an overambitious raid and was crushed at the Battle of Sisak in modern Croatia. The shock was enormous. The Ottoman war machine, long considered unstoppable, had stalled. Sensing weakness, Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, a man more interested in alchemy and collecting curiosities than leading armies, stopped paying tribute to the Sultan. That was it. The truce shattered. The Ottoman-Habsburg conflict exploded into what we now call the Long War. It sounds academic, almost dull. But for the people living here, it was an apocalypse stretched over years. Sultan Murad III declared holy war. The Pope declared a crusade. And the full weight of two superpowers slammed into this narrow strip of land along the Danube. Which brings us back to the question, why Esztergom? Because geography is destiny. The Danube is the main artery of Central Europe. Control the river, and you control the movement of troops, supplies, and gold. Esztergom sits on a bend in the river like a padlock. For the Ottomans, it was the northern shield protecting Buda, their prized capital in Hungary. As long as the crescent flew over Esztergom, Christian armies could never march safely on Buda. For the Habsburgs, the fortress was a knife at their throat, uncomfortably close to Vienna and Bratislava. Pry it open, and the road into Ottoman Hungary lay exposed. This wasn't just a siege, it was a test of strength between civilizations. On one side stood the Sublime Porte, capable of moving grain and gunpowder from Baghdad to Algiers with terrifying efficiency. On the other stood a fractured Christendom, united only by fear. By 1595, the war had settled into a brutal rhythm. Forts changed hands, villages vanished, but Esztergom remained the queen of the Danube, and taking it would demand blood on a scale few men truly understood. Mansfeld did. He knew failure here meant an Ottoman counterstrike aimed straight at Vienna. There was no margin for error. But he also knew something else. The Ottoman frontier was overstretched. Revolts simmered, logistics strained. The giant was wobbling, so the emperor's order came down. Strike the head, take Esztergom, and the bleeding frontier prepared to collect its payment. If you walked through the Christian camp in July of 1595, the first thing that hit you wouldn't be the stink of gunpowder. It would be the noise. 1,000 arguments happening at once in 10 different languages. The Pope and the Emperor called this force the Christian League, which sounds like unity, like brotherhood. But on the ground, it was a geopolitical Frankenstein's monster, stitched together with bad intentions and mutual distrust. At the core were the imperial regiments, mostly Germans and Walloons. These were the Landsknechts, professional mercenaries with flamboyant puffed sleeves, pikes as long as small trees, and an even bigger thirst for beer. To them, war was a contract. Show up, fight, get paid. If the pay was late, you mutinied. Simple. Then you had the Italians sent by the Pope and various dukes. This is where Monteverdi was stationed. They were the technocrats of the army, bringing the latest ideas in fortifications, artillery placement, and siege engineering. But the Germans looked down on them as soft, southern gentlemen who smelled like perfume and couldn't handle real fighting. The Italians, in turn, saw the Germans as uncouth barbarians who didn't know which end of a fork to use. Friction wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. Fights broke out over everything: food, firewood, women, even theology. And then there were the Hungarians. This was their land. They were fighting for their homes. Hungarian hussars, arguably the best horsemen in Europe, watched these foreign liberators with a suspicion that ran bone deep. Because the truth was uncomfortable. The Germans often treated Hungarian peasants no better than the Ottomans did. They looted villages, trampled crops, burned barns. Imagine the tension. You're a Hungarian soldier, expected to fight shoulder to shoulder with a mercenary who torched your cousin's farm last week, all to defeat an enemy who wants to conquer you. It was a powder keg. Trying to manage this chaos was Count Karl von Mansfeld. If anyone deserves a shred of sympathy in this story, it might be him. Mansfeld was a veteran. He understood discipline. But here, he wasn't just a general. He was a babysitter for the egos of Europe. Communication was a nightmare. Orders had to be translated from German into Latin, then into Italian or Hungarian. Imagine trying to coordinate a complex artillery barrage when half your officers literally can't understand each other. A command to hold could become charge. A request for reserve could be heard as advance. One mistake, and an assault turns into a stampede. So Mansfeld ruled with an iron fist just to keep the army pointed in the same direction. Even the camp itself was segregated. Germans in one sector, Italians in another. Hungarians often kept to themselves along the perimeter, like they were camping beside strangers they didn't trust. It was like three separate armies pretending to be one. But they did share one thing: the growing realization that Esztergom was not going to fall easily. As the siege dragged on, the cracks widened. Italians complained about the lack of wine. Germans complained about the heat and the food. Hungarians complained that the foreigners were moving too slowly, grinding their homeland into dust. And watching all of it, quietly, patiently, were Ottoman spies. They knew disunity when they saw it. They knew a divided enemy is a weak enemy. And that internal chaos makes what happens next even more remarkable. Because when the order finally came to attack, this dysfunction somehow had to stop. Men who despised each other would have to stand shoulder to shoulder in the mud and walk into fire. The Tower of Babel was about to crash into the unified discipline of the Janissaries. And for that, language didn't matter. Only survival did. High above the arguments, the air changed. Inside the fortress of Esztergom, there was no confusion of tongues. There was only the disciplined, eerie silence of men who knew they were trapped. Stand on the ramparts beside a Janissary. He wears the distinctive tall felt hat, the Burke, and carries a beautifully made arquebus. To Europeans below, he's a nightmare, a godless heathen, a monster to be exterminated. But strip away the propaganda and you find a human story that's even more tragic. Most of these elite soldiers weren't born Turks. Many were born Christians in the Balkans, Greece, Serbia, Bosnia, maybe even Hungary. Taken as children through the Dev Shirme system, they were converted, educated, and forged into the Sultan's personal weapon. No family, no land, no inheritance. Their core was their father. The Sultan was their god. Defending this rock wasn't a job. It was the only identity they had. The commander of the garrison, Kara Ali Pasha, looked down at the endless Christian sea of tents and did the mathematics. He had maybe 3,000 to 5,000 men. Below him was an army nearly 10 times that size. But Ali Pasha had an ace, the fortress itself. Esztergom wasn't just a castle. It was a layered death trap. The Ottomans had spent 50 years modernizing it. Thick, packed earth ramparts sat behind stone walls to absorb cannon impacts. Murder holes, overlapping fields of fire. Every approach route measured, mapped, and calibrated. If the Christians wanted in, they would pay for every step. Yet fear has a way of creeping through even the thickest stone. The garrison's greatest terror wasn't the cannon fire. It was the silence from the river. Esztergom lived and died by the Danube. Supplies, gunpowder, and reinforcements had to come by boat from Buda. The Christians understood this, and they were moving their fleet to blockade the river and choke off that lifeline. If the river was cut, food would stop, and a hungry Janissary can't hold a musket steady. Inside the barracks, the atmosphere grew suffocating. Soldiers would pause mid-prayer, listening for it, faint, rhythmic, impossible to ignore. Thump, thump, thump. Deep underground. The Christian sappers were digging. There is a special kind of psychological horror to siege warfare, knowing that beneath your feet, men you cannot see are crawling through darkness, packing barrels of black powder into a chamber that could blow you into the sky at any moment. You can't fight an enemy you can't see. You can only wait. But there was no talk of surrender. On this frontier, surrender often meant massacre anyway, and for a Janissary, cowardice was worse than death. Flee and your own officers execute you. Stay, and maybe you die a hero. So they prayed, 5 times a day. The call to prayer echoed off the stone and drifted down over the Christian camp like a defiant reminder. The shield of Islam still held. They checked powder flasks, sharpened yataghan swords, watched the horizon for sails from Buda that might never appear. The Europeans below saw a fortress. The men inside saw a prison. And they were determined to make it the most expensive prison the Habsburgs ever tried to break. Then the bombardment intensified. The walls began to groan under iron impacts. And while cannons hammered stone, a silent massacre unfolded inside the Christian tents. One that didn't need bullets, blades, or bravery. It started as a headache, then fever, high, relentless, then black spots on skin, delirium, madness. Men who survived hand-to-hand combat collapsed while standing guard, babbling about angels and devils before drowning in their own fluids. The soldiers had a name for it, the Hungarian disease. Today we call it typhus, and it didn't come from bad air, like the doctors believed. It came from lice. In the cramped, filthy siege conditions, hygiene was fantasy. Men slept pressed together for warmth, wearing the same clothes for months. Lice crawled from the dying to the living, carrying bacteria that dismantled the Christian League faster than any Janissary charge. The heat of July and August turned the camp into an incubator. Thousands of horses, thousands of men, open latrines, rotting refuse baking under the merciless sun of the Pannonian Plain. And then the flies came. Chronicles describe clouds of flies so thick they darkened the sky, landing on food, on wounds, on the faces of the sick. This invisible enemy didn't care about rank. It stalked officers and infantry alike. Mansfeld watched his roster shrink every morning. Not just soldiers, but engineers, gunners, specialists he needed to break Esztergom. The siege became a race against biology. Could they take the fortress before the army dissolved into fever and rot? And when the sun didn't kill them, the rain tried to drown them. The weather in 1595 was erratic, one more cruelty of the Little Ice Age. Torrential downpours turned trenches into canals. Men stood knee-deep in water for days. Trench foot set in. Flesh turned gray, then sloughed off. Monteverdi, huddled beside his damp instrument, must have wondered if this was the end of the world. The glamorous crusade had been stripped bare. There was only mud, fever, and waiting. But Mansfeld was ruthless. He knew stopping meant death. The sick were dragged to the rear, often just pulled out of sight, and the healthy were forced into double shifts. The digging continued. The cannons kept firing. Misery became industrial. And still, amid the squalor, the work of war crept forward. The sappers, coughing and weak, inched their tunnels closer to the walls. They were digging their own graves in more ways than one. The invisible enemy was weakening the body of the army, but somehow it hadn't yet killed its spirit. Because as the suffering piled up, one desperate idea began to dominate every mind in the camp. If we can just take Esztergom, we can finally get out of this hell. And that obsession, feverish, starving, irrational, was about to explode into the darkest craft of early modern warfare: mining. If the surface of the siege was a slaughterhouse, the underground was a tomb. Mansfeld understood that cannons alone wouldn't crack Esztergom. The Ottoman walls weren't just thick stone. They were reinforced with packed earth that swallowed iron cannonballs like a sponge. If he wanted to kill the fortress, he had to attack its roots. So he turned to the darkest craft of early modern siege warfare: mining. Imagine you're a sapper. You're not a knight. You're not even really a soldier. You're probably a coal miner from Saxony, recruited for one skill: digging. They shove you into a tunnel barely wider than your shoulders. The only light is a flickering tallow candle. The air is stale, heavy with dust, sweat, and the fear of suffocation. Above you is tons of soil and rock. Ahead of you is the enemy. The objective is simple and terrifying. You dig a gallery under the foundations of an Ottoman bastion. As you advance, you prop the roof with wooden beams. Once you're directly beneath the wall, you pack a chamber with barrels of black powder. Then you set the supports on fire and run like hell. The beams burn, the roof collapses, the powder ignites, and gravity does the rest. But the Ottomans weren't deaf. Inside the fortress, they had their own specialists. They placed bowls of water on cellar floors or scattered dried peas on drumheads and watched for vibrations. They pressed ears to the ground. They listened for it. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Pickaxes in the dark. When they found a tunnel, they didn't wait for the explosion. They dug countermines, and that led to some of the most nightmarish combat you can imagine. Picture breaking through a thin wall of dirt and suddenly coming face to face with an Ottoman miner in pitch blackness. No room to swing a sword, no space to fire a musket without collapsing the tunnel or deafening yourself. Men fought with pickaxes, shovels, knives, grabbing, stabbing, choking, buried alive in claustrophobic darkness. Still, Mansfeld's engineers kept going. By late August, the geometry of destruction was complete. They had successfully undermined the Watertown walls. The fuse was ready. On the surface, the army held its breath. Monteverdi, watching from a safer distance, would have seen the ground ripple before he heard anything, like the earth itself was trying to cough. Then came a deep, tectonic groan, and then eruption. Earth, stone, timber, and smoke blasted upward in a violent plume. A massive section of the curtain wall didn't just crack or crumble, it disintegrated. For a heartbeat, The inside of Esztergom was exposed, raw and vulnerable. Dust rolled across the breach like fog, and when it cleared, a jagged wound gaped in the defenses. The shield of Islam had been cracked, but a breach isn't a victory, it's an invitation. And as the smoke drifted away, the Christian infantry lowered their pikes and tightened their grips. The digging was over. Now the bleeding would begin for real. But Mansfeld didn't order the charge right away. He looked past the broken wall to the river. Connecting Esztergom to the opposite bank of the Danube was a lifeline, a massive pontoon bridge leading to the fortress of Parkani. Night after night, under darkness, small boats had slipped supplies and reinforcements across that bridge. As long as it stood, Esztergom was a hydra. Cut off one head, and more troops could march in to grow another. Mansfeld turned to the Christian flotilla. It was time to sever the artery. What followed was one of the most chaotic river battles of the 16th century. This wasn't glamorous open-sea warfare with towering galleons. This was a knife fight in a phone booth, fought on barges, rafts, and floating platforms, with currents yanking everything out of line. Christian boats, bristling with light cannons and musketeers, fought upstream toward the bridge. Ottoman defenders had packed the bridge and the Parkani bridgehead with every gun they could find. As the fleet closed in, the Danube erupted, cannonballs skipping across the water like thrown stones, smashing hulls, splintering oars, tossing men overboard. But the real horror happened on the bridge itself. Mansfeld sent troops to storm the bridgehead while the ships attacked the pontoons. The bridge became a bottleneck of death, a narrow wooden walkway swaying on the river current, jammed shoulder to shoulder with men in steel. There was no room to maneuver. Front ranks collided in a grinding shove of pikes and halberds. And if you fell, you didn't just hit the water. You hit it wearing 30 pounds of armor. There was no swimming. You sank like a stone, the battle fading above you into a muffled, murky silence. The Danube didn't run blue that day. It ran red. Corpses bobbed in the eddies, snagging on chains, spinning slowly like debris after a storm. And then came fire. Christian engineers unleashed fire ships. Burning rafts pushed downstream and hurled incendiaries toward the pontoons. Dry timber caught fast. Smoke billowed over the river, blinding both sides. Wood crackled, men screamed, and under the chaos, the bridge began to tear apart. The Janissaries on the Parkani side watched in horror as their connection to Esztergom drifted away in flaming chunks. Now the garrison was truly alone. No more food, no more powder, no more hope from Buddha. The destruction of that bridge was the psychological breaking point. The fortress had become an island in a sea of enemies. Mansfeld had applied the tourniquet. Now he turned back to the breach. The time for engineering was over. The butcher's bill had arrived, September 2nd, 1595. The sun rose over a scene that looked less like a battlefield and more like an open wound. The mine blast had torn a massive gap in the Watertown wall. Not a clean doorway, but a brutal slope of pulverized stone, shattered timber, and bodies. This was the breach. Mansfeld didn't need poetry or speeches. The men were starving, sick, and furious. They knew the only way to stop digging, to stop dying, was to climb that rubble and kill everyone on the other side. The drums rolled, a low, terrifying thunder. The forlorn hope went first. The volunteers, the desperate, the condemned, promised double pay or pardons if they survived the first wave. They didn't charge so much as scramble. You can't sprint up a landslide of loose rock. They clawed for footing, slipping on debris as Ottoman musketeers poured fire into them from the flanks. What followed was a meat grinder. In the narrow choke point, tactics dissolved. It became a crush. German landsknechts with two-handed swords hacked at hastily erected wooden palisades behind the breach. Italian musketeers fired point-blank into smoke so thick they could barely see their own hands. On the other side, the Janissaries fought like trapped animals. They knew the bridge was gone. They knew there was no retreat. They hurled grenades, clay pots packed with gunpowder and shards, into the mass of attackers. They poured boiling oil, molten lead. Medieval horror blended with chemical terror. The noise was indescribable. Even Monteverdi, miles away in the rear, would have heard it as a continuous, agonized roar. Thousands of men screaming in rage and pain, punctured by the flat crack of muskets. Inch by inch, sheer Christian numbers began to tell. Attackers climbed over the bodies of their own comrades to reach the top of the rubble slope. Once they spilled into the streets of the water town, the battle shattered into chaos. Hundreds of separate fights in alleys and doorways. I'd argue part of that answer sits right here, in the trenches of Esztergom. Years later, when Monteverdi published his 8th book of madrigals, he called them Madrigali guerrieri et amorosi, madrigals of war and love. He introduced a technique he called stile concitato, the agitated style. Rapid, repeated notes meant to mimic galloping horses, clashing swords, the heart-pounding terror of battle. It was the sound of Esztergom translated into music. He took the horror of 1595 and helped shape the birth of modern opera. And the final punchline? After 13 years of slaughter, after Mansfeld, thousands of Janissaries and countless civilians were dead, the border barely moved. The Ottomans didn't collapse. The Habsburgs didn't sweep into the Balkans. It was a stalemate written in blood. Esztergom itself stayed in Christian hands for only about a decade before the Ottomans took it back. And over the next century, it would seesaw between empires again and again. Today, if you visit Esztergom, you'll see a magnificent basilica dominating the skyline, built over the ruins of the fortress we just lived through. The trenches are gone. The bones are buried deep beneath pavement. The silence has returned. But stories like this matter because they strip away history's gold leaf. We love to talk about golden ages, the Renaissance, the triumph of civilization, while forgetting those eras were built on terrified miners digging in darkness, on Janissaries weeping for homes they couldn't remember, and on musicians trembling in the mud. The Siege of Esztergom wasn't just a battle. It was a collision of worlds that proved something brutally simple. Empires are fragile, but suffering is universal. So the next time you hear dramatic, heart-wrenching opera or glance at a map of Europe, remember the summer of 1595. Remember the invisible enemy. Remember the bridge of fire. And remember that history isn't just dates and kings. It's the smell of rain on a battlefield and the sound of a viola fighting to be heard over the thunder of cannons. If this journey into the forgotten corners of the past hit you, subscribe and turn on notifications. I've got so many more stories from the archives that deserve to be told. Stories of survival, betrayal, and the hidden mechanics of history. And before you go, here's a question to leave in the comments. Do you think great art, like Monteverdi's music, requires great suffering to exist? Or is that just a myth we tell ourselves to justify the tragedy? Long pikes were useless in tight streets. Men used knives, rocks, and musket stocks. They fought inside houses, in cellars, in the burning ruins of mosques. Eventually, the Ottoman defense snapped. Those not cut down fled up the steep winding path toward the upper castle, the citadel on the rock. The water town had fallen. The streets were slick with blood. Christian soldiers, fueled by months of misery and raw survival, began to sack the lower city. But Mansfeld kept his eyes on the real prize. Because the upper castle still loomed above them, gates sealed tight. The surviving garrison was crammed inside, looking down at their lost city, beaten, isolated. The shield of Islam had been shattered. The assault was over. But the dying wasn't. The sun set on a city in flames. Victors collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to celebrate, sleeping beside corpses of men they'd killed hours earlier. After months of constant noise, the silence that followed was almost worse. By early September, the guns finally stopped. The lower town was a smoking ruin. The upper castle, perched on its rock, was cut off completely. Inside, Ottoman soldiers drank muddy water and ate boiled leather. Kara Ali Pasha looked out at the devastation and knew the math no longer worked. No bridge, no relief force, only death or negotiation. He chose negotiation. The surrender was granted with the honors of war. Surviving Janissaries and civilians were allowed to leave, marching out under their banners, carrying personal weapons, but abandoning the heavy guns and the city itself. It was a somber procession. Men, women, and children walking out of a fortress that had been their home for 50 years, eyes fixed on the ground, heading toward Ottoman lines. The Holy League had won. The cross replaced the crescent. Te Deum was sung. Bells rang in Vienna and Rome. Across Europe, they celebrated the miracle of Esztergom. But in the general's tent, there was no miracle. Count Karl von Mansfeld, the architect of the victory, the man who held this dysfunctional alliance together through mud, mutiny, and typhus, was dying. History can be cruel, but this was a special irony. Mansfeld didn't die from a heroic sword wound during the final assault. He likely died from the same exhaustion, dysentery, and sickness that had been chewing through his camp for weeks. He spent every ounce of himself forcing this army to take the rock, and the moment the prize was secured, his body shut down. He conquered the city, only to be buried in it. The army he left behind was a shell. Without Mansfeld's iron grip and the unifying pressure of the siege, the old hatreds resurfaced immediately. Germans and Italians argued over loot. Hungarians looked at their liberated city, now rubble, and wondered if any of it had been worth it. Monteverdi walked through the captured streets. What he saw wasn't glory. It was a graveyard. The smell of death was so thick it tasted like metal. Bodies of friends and enemies tangled together in the breach, united only by flies. Civilians stared with famine-hollow eyes. This was the reality of the long war. Years of fighting, millions of ducats spent, thousands of lives sacrificed, in exchange for a ruined city and a dead general. Strategically, the map had changed. Esztergom was Habsburg again. But the war wasn't over. It would grind on for another decade, devouring more men, more money, more towns, until both empires were too exhausted to keep bleeding. As autumn leaves fell onto fresh graves outside the walls, soldiers packed their tents and marched toward the next siege, the next mud pit. For Mansfeld and thousands of others, the war ended here, in the shadow of the cathedral they had destroyed to save. Claudio Monteverdi survived. He packed away his viola da gamba, shook Hungarian mud from his boots, and returned to the glittering courts of Italy. But he didn't return unchanged. You can't watch men rot in trenches, see cities burn, and hear the acoustic violence of a siege without it carving something into your soul. Historians argue about what triggered the shift, from the balanced, orderly polyphony of the Renaissance into the turbulent emotional drama of the Baroque.